Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today I'm starting a new series called Reading Russian Poetry, where we'll be reading some really famous Russian poems in the original Russian. And as we do, I'll give you all of the vocab you'll need and all of the grammatical explanations you'll need to understand these poems completely. So this is a great way to practice your Russian, obviously, and also read some of the world's greatest poetry, in my opinion. And so in the beginning, at least, I'll try to include poems that have been featured in my textbooks. So my textbooks, for those of you using those, they're entitled Russian Through Propaganda. And those are books 1 and 2 of the series. And then books 3 and 4, they're called Russian Through Poems and Paintings. So that's where we start reading more poetry once we've gotten the grammar under our belts. Um, and so today I'm going to start with a poet that you may not have heard of. His last name's Khodasevich. Vladislav Khodasevich is his name. He's known mainly as an emigre poet. He's one of these people who was forced to leave Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. And this poem of his is one of my personal favorites. I think it's a brilliant little poem. It's very short. It's very thought-provoking. It's beautiful. It's sad. It's philosophical. It's everything you'd want from a good Russian poem. And this is also interesting in the sense that it alludes quite clearly, although not really explicitly, to a poem by Tyutchev. And so, for those of you who are serious about studying Russian literature and Russian poetry specifically, this is a good chance to get an appreciation of how a later poem can gain so much in meaning if you pick up on an allusion to an earlier poem in the canon by, for example, Pushkin, Lermontov, Tyutchev, right? Some poem that every poet would certainly know, and any educated reader would pick up on this on the reference, like in today's poem, because they would know their Tyutchev. And again, in a lot of cases, these references are really quite unmistakable. Um, so let me begin as usual by reading the Russian, and keep in mind that I'm not a native Russian speaker. I don't claim to be. And by the way, at this point, I haven't been to Russia in like 5 or 6 years since before COVID. So my pronunciation just keeps getting worse and worse, I feel like. But remember that it's very easy to find recordings of native speakers reading these poems, or for that matter, any short story, any Russian novel, like basically any classical Russian literary text that you could possibly be interested in. You can find multiple recordings on YouTube and elsewhere. And so you should always avail yourselves of those resources. They're so great. And of course, when I began studying, there was nothing like that available. So you should count yourselves lucky and always find those recordings of native speakers. But anyway, let me read, do the best I can with this poem. It's called Lastочки, or Swallows. Ласточки. Имей глаза, сквозь день увидишь ночь, не озарённую тем воспалённым диском. Две ласточки напрасно рвутся прочь, перед окном шныряя с тонким писком. Вон ту прозрачную, но прочную плеву не прободать крылом остроугольным, не выпорхнуть туда за синеву, ни птичьим крылышком, ни сердцем поневольным. Пока вся кровь не выступит из пор, пока не выплачешь земные очи, не станешь духом. Жди, смотря в упор, как брызжет свет, не застилая ночи. So before we read the poem more carefully and look at the grammar, let's talk very briefly about this allusion to Tyutchev. And I think the giveaway here is the way in which Khodasevich speaks of light as a kind of shroud, right? It's really kind of the opposite of the way we normally use this type of light and shadow, these sorts of metaphors in poetry. Normally we'd think of light as enlightening or whatever. But here, in almost sort of Gnostic fashion, he suggests that the light of the world is blinding us to some maybe deeper and perhaps darker reality. Although here in Khodasevich, in this poem, he does hold out the very real possibility of transcendence, but not in this life. So it turns out that the sky, for all of its brilliance and its beautiful blues and the light splashing around, as he says, it's a kind of prison, I guess not only in an existential sense, but also in terms of consciousness, in terms of trying to understand any sort of ultimate truth about the universe. And so that maybe strikes us as unusual. And again, I think that's what allows us to say quite straightforwardly that he surely had this poem by Tyutchev in mind when he was writing this. I think for almost any Russian poet, it's really quite inevitable. And so without discussing this poem here, I'll dedicate a separate video to this at some point, to this poem called День, ночь by Tyutchev. And if we look at the middle of the first stanza, he says quite plainly, день, сей блистательный покров, right? Day, this brilliant shroud, right? And then he goes on in the second stanza to say that, we feel more comfortable basically when this shroud of daylight is obscuring the truth from us. And when night comes and the shroud of day is cast aside and we're left face to face with this nocturnal abyss, we obviously find it very terrifying. And so he just kind of turns everything kind of upside down in that way. So let's start reading the poem in more detail, and we'll begin with the first stanza. You see, you've got all the vocab there underneath the text, and we see that the poem opens with this rather striking imperative, Имей глаза, right? Just a T imperative, literally have eyes, which already is striking, right? We're just two words into the poem, and I think probably we should at least, I think, already be struck by this commandment, because certainly most of us have eyes. It seems like the most obvious thing in the world. And the fact that Khodasevich would open the poem with this commandment suggests that there's more going on here than we normally assume, right? And I think he's alluding, at least obliquely, to a lot of these places in the New Testament where Christ compares physical blindness and spiritual blindness, right? The idea that some of the blind people that are healed in the New Testament, they have faith, right? They have the eyes of faith. They have a kind of spiritual vision that, for example, the Pharisees lack because they're blinded by self-righteousness and hypocrisy and all this stuff. And that's one reason, by the way, that this comes up, for example, when Christ is speaking in parables and his disciples even ask him, what does this mean? And why are you speaking in this kind of cryptic way? And of course, the answer is that to understand the meaning of the parable, you have to have spiritual insight. You have to see beyond the literal meaning of the story. And to do that, you have to have the eyes of faith, or the eyes of the Spirit. And so if we keep reading, Имей глаза, сквозь день, увидишь, ночь, right? Another striking phrase. Through day, you will see night. Through day, you'll see night. Now, сквозь, I always point out that this means through, but it does suggest some resistance, right? So if you're saying сквозь with the accusative, it suggests that you're pressing through something. It could be a crowd, it could be a wall, it could be like light kind of trying to press its way through some fabric or whatever. And that's quite important here, right? This idea that there's some resistance. We're not just seeing straight through to something in a way that's clear. We're peering through something else, namely through the day. And you see there the clear reference to Tyutchev's little conceit, right? That the day is what's obscuring some fundamental truth from us, right? Сквозь день увидишь ночь. Through the day you will see, you'll glimpse. Note that that's perfective. You'll manage to see the night. So we could understand that увидишь, of course it's future tense, so through the day you will see the night, but we could read into that this perfective meaning of success, right? To describe here one whose vision has forced its way through the shroud of the day, the obscuring shroud of day, and successfully glimpsed the night that lies beyond it. Okay, the second line, не озарённую тем воспалённым диском. So this озарённый, that's a PPP, right? Past passive participle, from озарить, meaning to illumine, right? And this is all modifying ночь, right? So you'll see the night. What kind of night? Well, a night not не озарённую in the accusative. And then we get an instrumental, not illuminated by that воспалённым диском. Now, Tim, words like Tom and Tot, right? Any of these words in Russian that are pointing to something far away, they can, of course, have just the literal meaning that something's far away and it's way over there, right? And of course, that would apply to the sun here. So we could read that quite literally. But often these also can bring a certain kind of dismissive quality. And that's the way I understand this, at least, right? Тем воспалённым диском, right? He's just pointing at this fiery disk in the sky. And he's suggesting with this tiem, I think, that it's not what it purports to be, right? It's not the all-illuminating, I don't know what kind of symbol of enlightenment that it maybe is often held out to be, because it's obscuring things from us. Okay, so we see the period. So now we're two lines into the poem, and we've got this kind of, again, basic idea set up. And then we get an image, a concrete image, also beautiful and kind of unexpected. Две ласточки, two swallows, right? So ласточки is in the genitive singular after две, right? Nouns after две, три, четыре, right? After two, three, four, take genitive singular. So две ласточки, that's our subject. And what are they doing? Напрасно рвутся прочь. Напрасно, in vain, futilely, right? In vain, they rvutsa. So this is from the verb rvаться, and this is a little hard to explain, but this is a really nice example. Sometimes one way to get at the meaning of a Russian verb that's quite tricky and it doesn't lend itself to literal translation is to look at the base verb. So in this case, let's ignore the sya, the reflexive particle, and just look at rvat. That means to jerk or tug or pull, and it's a kind of a violent motion. And so the way I would interpret this based on kind of my little schema is when we add the sya and we get rvatsa, that's it's conveying a kind of spontaneity where you have these birds that are spontaneously, so to speak, jerking around, tugging around, or actually in this case, they're flying in this kind of jerky, angular pattern as if they're trying to break free and break through the sky, right? So we've already set up the sky, or more specifically so far, the fiery disk in the sky as something that obscures. And then we get this image of swallows it's as if they're flying, as if they're trying to break through the sky. And he's going to reinforce that idea later. Right now, that's not quite fully developed. But I think one thing that's important here is to think about how swallows fly. If you've ever seen this, and I always tell students that I remember growing up, I grew up on a farm, and we had these really old barns, and there were tons of barn swallows in these barns, and they would build their nests, made out of mud up in the rafters. But when dusk came, they would be flying out, I don't know, by the hundreds. It seems like there were so many of them, and to catch insects. They had their wings kind of look sharp, and they're darting around back and forth, as Khodasevich is about to describe, chasing insects. And so I think that the quality of their flight is one thing that's allowing him to invoke the swallows so effectively as these beings who are trying to break free of the world in some sense. Now, the final line of the first stanza, Перед окном шныряя с тонким писком. Перед окном means in front of the window. And so at this point, that phrase suggests now that we've situated our speaker, our poetic ya, right? He seems to be at a window, and he's watching these sparrows fly outside his window, or as he says, literally in front of the window. Which is quite curious because now we've introduced kind of a second membrane of sorts, but one that's transparent. Right, the glass of the window is transparent, and he's able to see through it without any resistance, and probably without even really giving it much thought. And I think he's saying that we look at the sky and we think of it as something that's brilliant and illuminated, and possibly illuminating, but it's also a kind of window through which we don't ordinarily see. Now, remember, Tютчев was saying that we do see through it, obviously, at night. But anyway, if we stick with Khodasevich here, шныряя is a verbal adverb, a deverbal from an imperfective verb. So шныряя means to dart about, to kind of flit about back and forth. And it's, as an adverb, is telling us how these swallows are trying to rvаться прочь, right? How they're trying to break free or get away, right? They're doing so by darting back and forth, с тонким писком, with a thin, tонкий literally means thin. It can be subtle. I think here it means, describing kind of a thin sound, so to speak, or a high-pitched sound, but it also makes them sound rather fragile and weak. And I think it's underscoring the futility of their attempted escape. By the way, a pisk can be almost any high-pitched sound in Russian, including a beep or a squeak or a squeal or almost anything like that. So in this case, we might say it's the sounds of the birds chirping. By the way, as we're going through this poem, hopefully one thing you're picking up on is how a lot is the difficulties of translating this. A lot of these subtleties kind of go missing. But anyway, so far he's introduced a kind of a basic metaphor, right? This night and day and seeing night through the day. And also, he situated himself as the speaker of the poem in front of a window. And also, we've got this kind of image or metaphor of the two swallows that he's now going to develop more carefully in the second stanza, right? We get a kind of development here. And he says, Вон ту прозрачную, но прочную плеву. And again, we have this idea of that over there, far away. So von is kind of like vot. Vot, you say vot when you're showing something that's close to you. Von is kind of the same idea, but it's something far away, like look way over there or over yonder, as you might say, right? Von. And again, we get this tot, right? Something that's over that, right? That there, which, as I said earlier, can convey a kind of dismissive attitude. And I think, again, that makes sense here in this poem, just based on context, right? That there, прозрачную, но прочную плеву. Now, note that all of that is in the accusative, right? And we don't have a verb yet. We don't know what's being done to this transparent but firm membrane. So прозрачный means you can see through it, right? Pro means through. Прочный means something that's solid, something that's firm. It offers resistance. And so he's describing here very nicely and kind of unusually the sky as a pleva. And again, we don't, at this point in the poem, we don't really know what he's talking about. A lot of this seems kind of strange, this pleva. What is he talking about? This membrane that's transparent yet solid. But of course, he's probably encouraging us to realize that, yes, he's talking about the sky. And as we keep reading, he says that this membrane or this film, he says, не прободать крылом остроугольным. With an infinitive, the idea here is that one cannot pierce it with a sharp angled wing, right? That's the sharp kind of, again, look up a picture of a swallow. You'll kind of see hopefully what I mean, right? With this angular wing, this sharp angled wing. Остроугольный is created from острый, meaning sharp, and угол, meaning angle, or it can also mean corner, right? So the idea here is that one cannot, this membrane is not to be pierced with a sharp angled wing. And then he repeats that another infinitive phrase like that, не выпорхнуть туда за синеву, right? So literally not to fly out to there, to a position beyond the blueness, literally, right? So he's saying it's impossible. One can't do it, right? Не выпорхнуть. That action is not to be. It can't be. One can't fly out to there beyond the sинева. Sинева is a noun meaning something that's синий, right? Something that's a deep blue. And one way to think of синий is this kind of deep, rich blue of a sky, right? Of the sky. And then he says, "Ни птичьим крылышком, ни сердцем подневольным," right? Neither, we get the ni, right? Neither nor. Neither, and then two instrumentals, neither with a bird's wing, nor with a captive heart, right? Now let's look at the words more carefully. Птичий is a little soft adjective meaning something related to a птица, right? So, and then крылышко is a diminutive of крыло, the word for wing. And again, you see how here too, he's using the diminutive, I think, to suggest the fragility, this tiny little bird that's stuck in this futile attempt to escape, and everything about it, from its little chirps to its wing, the wings, they're weak, they're insignificant, they're kind of helpless, right? But now he kind of completes this metaphor. He brings it to its fruition by saying that these birds' wings are kind of like our captive heart, right? They symbolize our сердце подневольное, right? Подневольный means something that's underneath неволя, meaning the lack of volia. The word volia usually translates as will, but it more broadly, it really means freedom, right? The freedom to do what you want, volia. So подневольный means you're under captivity. Okay, so if we look now at the third stanza, of course, at this point in the first stanza, he introduced some imagery and a kind of metaphor. In the second stanza, he developed it. And now at the end here in the third stanza, we're expecting sort of the real gut punch from this poem. And he certainly delivers. This is a brilliant, I think, just a brilliant little stanza with a killer last line. Anyway, пока вся кровь не выступит из пор, right? Пока means while, right? So this is always a tricky thing for people coming from English because in English we say things like until something happens, but the Russian idiom is while something doesn't happen. So it's kind of, right, the Russian is going to be negated. So the way to think of it literally here is пока вся кровь не выступит из пор, literally while while all the blood will not, literally, it's a perfective verb, выступить, while it doesn't come out, is pour, from the pores. Okay, so again, I'm trying to get at the literal meaning. Hopefully, it's always kind of choppy when you do that. But in smoother English, we'd say something like, until all the blood seeps from your pores, right? Until all the blood comes out of your pores. Let's return to that in just a moment. There's a lot going on there, but let's just complete again, he has this kind of iteration here. A second paka in line 2, he says, пока не выплачешь земные очи. Again, reading literally, while you will not weep out your earthly eyes, right? Or we'd say until you cry your eyes out, as we say in English, right? Пока не выплачешь земные очи. So земной is an adjective meaning something related to земля, something earthly. So again, we have our idea, our physical eyes. I mentioned earlier, physical vision versus some kind of spiritual vision. He's already suggesting that you're not going to have this kind of real face-to-face, I guess, spiritual insight until you've cried your earthly eyes out. Right. By the way, we saw earlier the word глаза. That's the plural of glass. That's the normal word in modern Russian for eye. But there is this other word you should definitely know, oka. The plural is очи. That's kind of the older Slavic word, kind of the basic word for eye. In Russian nowadays, that's mostly poetic. So we see it a lot in poetry or in songs or whatever, but it's not, you wouldn't go around normally saying that for eye. Okay, now let's get the beginning of the third line, не станешь духом, you will not become spirit. So here now we're really at the crux of what he means to say with this poem. And as you probably know, stать, after verbs of becoming, we get the instrumental, right? So дух means spirit. Не станешь духом means you will not become spirit, right? Again, it's future tense because the verb is imperfective. So what does he mean by this phrase about all of your blood seeping from your pores? It seems generally, obviously, like it's just a grotesque kind of image of human suffering and agony. But there's something more specific, I think, going on here. We mentioned earlier the rather oblique reference to this biblical theme of spiritual vision versus physical vision and things like this, and certain words of Christ. And this idea of sweating blood comes up in certain gospel accounts of the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane when Christ is praying on the eve of his crucifixion. And apparently this, of course, again, this idea of sweating blood comes up in the Gospels. And apparently this is a medical condition called hematidrosis, right, sweating blood. You can look that up on Wikipedia or whatever if you want to. But I'm gonna consult Pasternak. I thought I'd also mention this just because it comes up in this other wonderful poem, which I'll dedicate a video to at some point, called Gethsemansky Sad, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Pasternak retells, drawing heavily on gospel accounts, he retells the story of Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is called the Orthodox icon of this scene is usually called the Malenia Chashya, the prayer or the praying about the cup or the chalice. And this idea of the cup, this metaphor comes up over and over when Christ is foretelling his crucifixion and resurrection, the cup of death, as Pasternak puts it, right? The idea of drinking this cup of death, right? So in Pasternak, we have this stanza, another beautiful stanza. «И глядя в эти черные провалы, пустые, без начала и конца, чтобы эта чаша смерти миновала, в поту кровавом он молил Отца», right? So I've got a lot to say about this stanza. I'll try to control myself, but just pointing out again this idea of поту кровавом он молил Отца If we turn to the Gospel of Luke, for example, we see he says, being in agony, he, that is Christ, prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. So apparently this can happen. Again, supposedly this is an attested medical condition where someone under extreme agony will literally sweat blood. I don't know exactly the mechanism of that, but anyway, the point here is that if we take Christ's suffering, his agony on the eve of crucifixion, this horrific death, then we can take that as kind of the most extreme sort of human suffering we could imagine. Now, of course, one part of this, if we kind of delve off into theology rather quickly, is this idea of kenosis, that Christ emptied himself of his divine nature and took on human flesh in order to redeem it and make it, as it's often said, Christ became human so that we might become God, right? That we might become deified. That's the Orthodox idea of theosis, or deification, or sanctification, it's sometimes called. Now we see that for Khodasevich, the trajectory is not for spirit to take on flesh as Christ did, but rather for human flesh to become spirit, right? That's just kind of the basic spiritual trajectory for transcending the world of flesh and the physical world and all of its illusions and things like this, right? And he's saying, again, rather, it's both kind of optimistic and pessimistic, I guess, right? He's saying that transcendence is possible, but not within the world, right? Not through our physical eyes or whatever. And hence we have this rather stern pronouncement, right? Nie staniesz duchem. You will not become spirit until you've suffered, until you've drunk the cup of suffering to its dregs, so to speak, to use the biblical metaphor. And so then the poem ends again with this, we're back to this imperative. And it's great to always look at a brilliant poem like this and see there's almost always some almost formal rounding off, either a repetition or something. And we hear at the very end, get another imperative, jdi, right? We open with the Imei, глаза, have eyes, right? And now he says, jdi, wait, смотря в упор, looking point blank. Vupor means you're right up against something. This is, the root here is pur. It's a non-syllabic root. It has to do with pressing or pushing or being up against something. So vupor means literally like you're pushing right up against, you're right up next to it, basically. So in English, we could say point blank. So wait, looking point blank, как брызжет свет, не застилая ночи. So looking literally how the light splashes, not obscuring the night, or how the light splashes without obscuring the night. And there again is that idea from Tютchev that he's using here to round off the poem. And I love the way he describes light as almost liquid, right? That's splashing about in this brызжет, in this way that suggests this kind of dazzling, just being inundated with light. And again, it sounds like something that should be beautiful, and perhaps in a sense it is, but in a purely imminent earthly sense, right? It's blocking our vision from piercing through to the truth. So anyway, on that happy note, there's a lot more we could say about this poem, but we would just be kind of meandering off into all sorts of kind of philosophical and existential reflections and God knows what else. So I'm going to leave it there for now. So thanks for watching, and I'll try to be back soon with another poem. До свидания, товарищи.